Hello and welcome to another episode of Tell Muses, a podcast by storytellers, with storytellers, for storytellers, and anyone interested in the art of oral storytelling. Today, Simona and I are very, very pleased to have with us a lovely friend all the way from the Orkney Island, Scotland. Please welcome Fran, Flett, Hollinrake. Woohoo!
Hello,
Welcome,
hello,
Fran.
hello, everybody.
It's good to have you with us, Fran.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about who Fran is?
Well, so my name is Fran, and I've been telling stories probably for about 30 years now. I studied Scottish history when I was at university, and when I left university, I went to live in the lovely city of Edinburgh, and I became a ghost tour guide. Now, I've always had an interest in ghost stories ever since I was a little girl. I've loved ghost stories. I would lie in bed, I would read them, I would scare myself silly, hiding under the bedclothes, but I just couldn't get enough. So it was a dream job for me, really, to be able to walk the streets of the, ancient capital dressed in a black cloak and, telling ghost stories. So I did that for about 10 years, and then I moved to the Orkney Islands. Now, Orkney is right off the north coast of Scotland. We're about 59 degrees north latitude. And I have Orcadian ancestry, which is what drew me here. And most of the jobs that I have had have been involved in heritage, history, stewarding historic monuments, but I've always kept the storytelling going as part of that. It's always been a very important part of what I've done. And then I am also an independent storyteller as well. So we've lived in Orkney for just over 20 years now. My main job, my day job, is the curator of St Magnus Cathedral, which is a beautiful 12th century cathedral here in Orkney. But I do other things as well. That's my main job. And then storytelling is something I do around that.
How did your passion for storytelling start? Did you grow up in a storytelling family? I know that in Scotland, storytelling it's big, and also there are many storytellers inside families. So how did it all start for you?
Well, I think although I was born in Scotland, my family moved to England when I was quite young. Both my parents love to talk, and my dad is one of these raconteurs. He'll just hold an audience. He's always got something to say to anybody. And I think, it wasn't a traditional storytelling kind of role that he played, but he was always, with the anecdotes and the little stories and the little jokes. And he would always find something in common with everybody. He can still do it. I mean, he's into his 80s now, and he can still find something in common with every single person he meets, which I think is a real skill to kind of link those things up. But I would say that my love of stories came from books. I was a reader from before I went to school, and I always loved books. My mum really encouraged that. Well, they both did really, but my mum saw that I had an interest in folk tales. And so for birthdays, for Christmases, I very often got a new book of folk tales or fairy tales. Some of them have stayed with me. Some of those stories have stayed with me for decades after I first read them. And those books are so precious to me. So that's really where its origins are.
And you said that you lived in Edinburgh for 10 years, like on the Royal Mile, there's the Scottish Storytelling Centre. Did you used to go there and either tell or listen to stories?
Not very much. So we're going back to the 1990s, but we as tourist guides telling ghost stories were not considered to be proper storytellers by the Storytelling Centre. And we tried on many occasions to make those links about how we could share stories, about how we could have a platform, about how we could, and they absolutely did not want to know. They considered us to be not proper storytellers because we were commercial, because we were telling silly stories, but no, we didn't have any or very little connection with the Scottish Storytelling Centre. And funnily enough, it's only since moving to Orkney that I have now made that connection and have friends in the wider storytelling community. I don't know why they weren't that keen on it, but yeah, certainly my relationship with them is good now.
I have come across that behavior before from purists, let us say, of storytelling.
Yeah.
There's this kind of elitistic look towards other very, very closely related ways to do storytelling. There's not just one proper way to do it, right? Some people may look at it like that, but there are really so many different things you can do. Simona and I are educators, for example. So in our line of work, it is a custom to use stories with children, more to literature, but when you address audience already, it's very closely related to actual storytelling.
Yeah.
I have done some tour guiding myself here on my island in groups of tourists in summer, and that also is storytelling, of course. Why shouldn't it be? I mean, it had to do with the history of the place and the country. I think it's part of storytelling as a more general idea. It doesn't have to be specific channels through which you can only reach one particular aim, you know.
Yes, I mean, I should add that they are absolutely not like that now. They have widened their approach considerably to include tourist guides, to include more literary events, more kind of child-based workshop things. So they've really have expanded what they do, and they're a lot more kind of inclusive and welcoming to people who've not gone down the more traditional storytelling route. And I think that was very much that we hadn't learnt it from our granny's knee, and we hadn't been brought up in a rich tradition of stories that somehow, because we were all historians. That was one of the things that the tour company insisted on, is we all had a history degree. So, it wasn't as if we were just popping up and saying, hi, here we are. We had quite a good background, but yeah, they didn't really consider us to be proper storytellers for a long time. But you're absolutely right, Despina. Storytelling, I mean, I work as a tourist guide as well in Orkney, and it is the way you portray the history. It's the way you describe the culture. It all comes out in storytelling, and that's the bit people love, and it's the bit they remember. If you tell them a story, they'll remember how it made them feel. You can tell them some facts, and that's fine, but if you can weave it in story, it has a much greater emotional impact. And then people go away feeling that they've had a rich experience.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't think that people are interested in hearing hard facts or the exact date of a battle or the exact date of the construction of a building. They're not interested in that. What people can relate to is other people's stories. You're absolutely right. And it's the same with teaching. It's the same with guided tours. The whole basis of storytelling is inclusion and not division, of course, right? So I wanted to ask Fran, those folk tales you were telling us about earlier, or fairy tales you found in books, do you get to tell any of those?
I do. It's interesting. There's a beautiful book which came out in the 1970s, which is called Folk Tales of the British Isles. And it had the most amazing illustrations in it. And it had folk tales from Wales and Ireland, Scotland, England. And one of the stories was the story of Asipattle and the Stoorworm. That was the first time I'd ever come across that story. And I live in Orkney, and Asipattle and the Stoorworm is a really, really big story in Orkney. It's an Orkney-based folktale, and it's our origin story. I feel like we came full circle from, me at the age of 10 reading this story for the first time, and then being here and living in the landscape that the story is about. And I do tell that story, and it's just lovely to think that all those years ago that little seed was planted. And here I am now looking out at the Orkney landscape out of my window, thinking about the story and how the land was created. So yeah, that one has stayed with me for a lot of years.
We've heard about that book before, Simona, in another interview. Yeah, people seem to love that book. Must read. Note to self. So those old stories, do you reshape them somehow? Do you make your own versions, or do you tell them like in their authentic style?
That's a really interesting question. Now, there is a tradition, one of many traditions of storytelling, where you learn a story by learning every word in a particular order. And this is how the story is told. And you must not deviate from this, because otherwise you're doing it wrong. And there are storytellers that I have come across in the past who have learnt stories like that and have passed them on like that. And that is an absolutely valid way of doing it. And it's a long, rich tradition of an oral culture and how to pass on stories and information. I don't do that because I feel that for me, and I'm just speaking for myself here, I'm not saying that that's the wrong approach. What I'm saying for me is that I have to feel it. I have to believe it. And in order to do that, I have to say it in my own words. What I don't do is change the story. I won't change anybody's names and I won't change key elements. I might adapt and I might put in a little bit for a bit of humor. You do. Of course, you make modifications, and I don't tell it in the same way. I don't tell stories in the same way every single time. It depends on me and the mood I'm in. It depends on the audience that I'm speaking to. You kind of adapt your stories in terms of style, I suppose is what I'm saying. So that might mean that, words are slightly different or sentences are shorter or parts are more elaborated. But the story essentially remains the same. I'm not going to be changing the plot of a story. But yeah, I like to tell them in my own style, my own idiom, because that's who I am. And I think that's important for storytellers to find that voice, to find their own style, because it conveys you. It comes across in your voice, how you feel about it. And I think that's really important.
That's really important. I was wondering, Fran, do you only tell folk tales, or since you have a background in history and as an historian, do you also tell stories like stories of historical facts?
Oh, yes. I draw quite a lot on the historical tradition as well. And actually, to be honest, that's kind of how I got through my history qualifications, my degrees, was learning history as stories. I suppose I heard it once described as being a narrative historian. I'm quite happy to do the analysis and look at the broad shifts and all the rest, but it's the stories that always get me. It's the individuals, it's their tales. So I use historical stories all the time, particularly in the cathedral where I work. I use storytelling to tell the history of the building constantly. So history comes out a lot. To me, well, I don't know. It's probably the same I suspect it's the same in Italian, Spanish. It's certainly the same in French, that the word for story and the word for history are the same word. And that really sums it up for me. To me, they go hand in hand. They really do belong to each other. And even if the lines are a bit blurry sometimes, I feel that that is a good thing. And it allows a little bit of magic to seep into the cold historical facts. And I think that magic is really important. And actually, history is the stories that we tell about the past. History is not, this is what happened. The past is what happened. History is how we interpret the past and how we tell the stories to each other. And it changes all the time. We're constantly examining these things as historians. There's been a lot recently in the media about how, what we think of as re-examining history is seen as rewriting history. And this is one of the criticisms that's often thrown at history, you're rewriting history. That is literally what historians do. It's our job is to re-examine, look at things through a different lens, bring a different slant. New evidence comes to light, new information. Of course, we re-examine the whole time. And I think that storytelling is such an important part of that because it allows you to kind of piece together a narrative that has a meaning. And of course, that might change. That might change the whole time. And that's what you do. You use those faculties to develop thought. I don't know if I'm expressing this very well, but to me, history and stories go absolutely together to the benefit of both, I feel.
If I get it right, historians are being accused of doing their job.
Yes. You are rewriting history. Yes, that is exactly what we're doing. Yes, that's right. You just think, well, where do you go with that? How do you cope with that sort of criticism other than saying, well, yes, that is actually what we do.
Oh, you can simply say thank you,
Yes,
Thank you for acknowledging this is what I do.
Yeah. Good point.
I couldn't agree more on what you said about history and story going hand in hand because I'm a great history buff. I just love history and whenever I have free time, I'm listening to history podcasts.
Oh, me
And
too. I
I
love a
just
history
love it.
podcast.
And whenever I ask my students, what are your favorite subjects at school? None of them ever say history. I always say, oh, so why don't you like history? They say, oh, facts, numbers, things to
Boring.
remember. It's boring. And I'm like, history doesn't have to be like this. Maybe you're familiar with it, but there's a great British historian, Dan Jones, who he's very famous
Mm-hmm.
also as a TV presenter. And he's
Yeah.
got this wonderful podcast called This is History, where
Mm-hmm.
he tells stories of what happened during the Plantagenet period of British history. And it's like listening to a story because
Yeah.
he makes it come to life, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's history, and that's what we should do with historical facts.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
So linguistically speaking, you know that everything started with the Greeks, right?
Of course.
Of course, we're the beginning of all European culture ever. But linguistically speaking, like honestly now, the word history and the word story are not two different terms in Greek. It's the same word, it's historia. There's a different term for folk tales, more modern term, which is fairy tales nowadays, used to be folk tales in the past,
Mm.
or wise tales. That is paramithi, but story and history are the same word. And paramithi, which means folk tale, has its root in consolation. It's the stories we use to console and make ourselves feel
Oh,
better.
oh wow. Oh, that's
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think people are missing the etymology. We've lost that connection, that, brain synapses, but it's there if you look at it.
I do wonder too. I know a lot of people have sort of things like favorite films and they watch when they need to be comforted, when they need to wrap up in a blanket and with a hot drink and just be soothed, be comforted. And the familiarity and the magic of those films or whatever does exactly that. It's very consoling. So yeah, I think we still have a little bit of that in our culture for sure.
We had a talk with Jason Buck the other day. I think you know Jason, don't you, Fran?
Yeah, yeah.
We were talking about dark tales and how we're very much into them. And we were discussing that one of the reasons people like dark horror tales or ghost tales and the like is, first of all, the fact that you find the words to describe the inner fear or whatever that we might be feeling over everyday things like real things. And then, as Jason pointed out, and I found this really lovely, because at the end of the story, it's like waking up from a bad dream and you're back to reality, which is fine. Everything is fine. So you're safe. It's okay.
Yes. And ghost tales and horror tales, what they do is they allow us to explore those things within the context of being in a safe place. So we are in our place of safety, but we are exploring dark things. We are looking down dark avenues and thinking about the horrors that might exist. And it allows us to confront them and to explore them and to think about them and to have some sort of contact with them, because you do have that emotional response. But you then, absolutely right, you wake up and you're back in your world, which is a lot safer and a lot nicer place to be. But the stories allow you to get close to those things. And it may be that it kind of gives you an armor of some kind to deal with horrors if they do happen, because you've already had that experience of getting close to them. I think a lot of stories have that experience, not just horror stories, but all stories, whatever they might be about, adventure or love or excitement or danger or whatever, allow us to experience those things without being in danger ourselves, I think is how I can best describe it.
I've had the fortune of listening to Fran tell tales on several occasions because we meet once monthly at the Litchfield Circle, Simona. And Fran, I've heard you tell folk tales, historical tales, sometimes even personal tales. You have a huge array of different genres you use. Do you have one favorite? Is it still ghost tales?
I do still love a ghost story, but I wouldn't say they were my stock in trade now. I told them for a long, long, long time. And I think now I use them sparingly if the mood takes me. So that's a really difficult question because, again, it depends on your kind of audience. I do have a few stories which are my favorites. I think everybody has stories that they just love to tell. Well, I don't know. See, some of the history stories are just fantastic, and some of the folk tales are fantastic. I also have, as you, as you long-suffering Lichfield Story Circle know, I also have a great fondness for saints, and I love stories about saints. I find them absolutely fascinating, and there's just weirdness all over. You know how we have accepted these things into our the normal way about how we think about things seems utterly bizarre to me because they're really strange stories and you just think, oh, everyone's just fine with this, you know. So yeah, I'd say at the moment probably saint stories are the ones that kind of I like telling the most, but I really like mixing it up. As you say, I like the history, I like the folk tales, I like personal stories, family stories as well. So yeah, it's a tricky one really to name a favorite, isn't it?
I was thinking about a favorite genre, but still, you don't have to choose. You don't have to pick. You can have several ones. But speaking of stories, your favorite ones, and thinking about them, is there any one particular story jumping out of your head right now as we speak?
Um, well, it would probably be a story about a saint. One of Scotland's most famous saints, I think, is probably Saint Columba. And he goes back to the very early church in Scotland, really before it became part of the Catholic hierarchy and structure. Although Columba himself was a part of that structure, but the stories about him are all so gentle. I mean, the word Columba in Latin means dove. You know, he was just a peaceful person. Yeah, one of my favorite stories is about Saint Columba. So, would you like me to share it? Is that
Yes, please.
Columba was very famous in his day as a cleric and a missionary. And then, of course, after his death, he was venerated, still is, as a saint. But in the very early days of Columba's missionary, he was very much full of doubt. He really didn't know if he was doing the right thing. And he was, you know, he'd given up a lot to kind of wander and preach. And he just didn't know if this was what God wanted for him. And he was wandering the glens and mountains of Scotland and communing with nature. A lot of the early Celtic saints spent a lot of time with the birds and the animals and the plants. And the idea was that the closer to nature you got, the closer to God you were. God was in all these things, you know. And there he was wandering, and he was very disconsolate, and he was having a bit of a bad day, I think we could say. And he was wandering, and he just, you know, just looked up and he heaved a big sigh, and he said, God, what am I doing the right thing? Is this really what you want from me? Am I truly on the right path? God, if you think I am, if I'm doing your work as you wish me to do, show me, give me a sign. Nothing. Columba just thought, oh, really? And he heaved another big sigh and he just continued. You can imagine him dragging his feet along the loch side. And he was just wandering along, just lost in his own fog of despair. And he heard a sound. And that sound was a kind of splashing sound. And it was quite regular. It was a sort of sploosh, 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 sploosh. And he thought, what's that? What's that noise? And as he walked further along the loch side, he could see that there was something by the loch side, quite small, and that seemed to be where the sound was coming from. And as he got a bit closer, the noise got a bit louder. Sploosh, sploosh, sploosh. And as he got closer and closer, he realized that what he was looking at the banks of the loch was a squirrel. Now, squirrels found all over the UK, but most of them that you will see on the streets of Britain are the grey squirrel, which is quite a largish thing, maybe that size of a small cat. And they have, unfortunately, rather pushed out the native squirrel, which is the red squirrel. Now, you still find red squirrels in Scotland, and they are much smaller. They're about half the size of a grey squirrel. They're tiny little things, and they really are very delicate. If you ever see one, they're just quick as lightning, with a bushy tail and their tiny little feet, and they're just gorgeous, beautiful little things. And there, sitting by the banks of a loch, was a little red squirrel. And Columba got a bit closer, and as he approached the squirrel, he could see what the squirrel was doing. And the squirrel was bending down, and it was scooping up tiny little handfuls, pawsfuls of water, and throwing them onto the bank. So it was with his tiny squirrel paws, he was scooping up the water, and he sploosh, sploosh, sploosh. Columba came along, and he looked down at the squirrel, and he said, coughed. Excuse me, squirrel. And the squirrel looked up and said, yes, what? Because obviously it was a talking squirrel. Columba said, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing? And the squirrel said, oh, well, I don't mind you asking at all. I'm emptying the loch. And Columba said, I beg your pardon? And the squirrel said, well, I'm emptying the loch. I'm scooping the water out, and I'm putting it onto the bank. And Columba looked at him and said, well, squirrel, if you don't mind me saying so, I mean, you are a very, very little squirrel. Yes, I am. And you have very tiny squirrel paws. I do, tiny squirrel paws. Look at the size of the loch. Look at how big it is. Look at your tiny squirrel paws. Do you honestly think, I mean, let's get real, squirrel. Do you honestly think that you are ever going to manage to empty the loch? And the squirrel said, well, it is a very big loch, and I do have very tiny squirrel paws. So, you have a point. You have a point. And Columba, full of self-righteousness, wandered along the loch a bit. But after a few minutes, he could hear behind him, sploosh, sploosh, sploosh. And he turned around and he walked back, and there, the squirrel, still bending down by the loch, still with its tiny squirrel paws, was still emptying pawsfuls of water onto the bank. And Columba came along and said, squirrel, what? Wait a minute, look, we just had this conversation. You agreed, very big loch, very tiny squirrel paws. Why are you persisting in this? And the squirrel said, well, because it will make it easier for all the squirrels who come after me. And that is how St. Columba knew that he was on the right path.
It's a brilliant story.
Thank you. I should give the origin, like a good storyteller, of that story. It came from a wonderful Scottish storyteller called David Campbell, who is just a legend in Scottish storytelling. And I've met him a few times. And the first time I heard him tell that story, I thought, oh my goodness, I love it. It's just such a beautiful story. So yeah, David Campbell was the origin for that.
It reminds me of that tale with the, what do you call it? The very tiny little bird that's trying to put out the fire.
The hummingbird. The
Right.
hummingbird story, yes. Yeah, I was thinking the same. I'm doing what I can.
Yeah, all those little things just make a
But the
difference.
squirrel was doing what he could for the next generation. That's even lovelier.
Maybe it's just me, but why did the squirrel want to empty the loch?
That I'm not entirely sure about. It just seemed to be that that's what its mission was. That's what he was there to do. But it's a good question. So maybe I should have a think about that and think about maybe because it would make travel easier, or maybe because I don't.
It had to go to the other side and pick up the best nuts, obviously.
Yeah.
That's it. Seeking the best nuts.
Yeah, this is way better than most stories I have in my mind from my childhood of Orthodox tales coming from my granny, which were much gorier. And, all the saints and the martyrs had to go through torture in order to gain their holiness. Yeah,
Oh yeah,
not
it's
very good tales to tell to children, actually. From my personal trauma.
No, I mean, that is one of the gentlest saint stories. You're right. When it comes to martyrdom, there's a whole array of horrible, disgusting ways to die.
Yeah, and in many forms of art, paintings as well, depictions and the like.
Yeah. I always feel with saints that they kind of took over the role of when we had in pre-Christian belief systems, when we had a pantheon of gods, when we had a lot of gods, and they all specialized. I mean, most of the gods you could appeal to, but if you had a particular need, you had a sore foot or your crops weren't growing or you wanted to have a pain-free childbirth, whatever, there were individual gods who specialized in those things. And then when monotheism came along and it's one God, and he's a busy fellow. So the saints really took on those roles of those specialist areas. You think there's a saint for everything that you can appeal to if you need help. So I think they kind of took on the roles of, the mini gods. That was quite an important function, I think.
That's very, very true. In the guided tours I did here, after learning more about my own island, we have a visit to this particular church that was like the second one built on the island. And the people who built it, they were refugees. They were not affluent people. And they did not know much about building churches. What they did know was how to build ships. So what they did underneath the facade is an actual boat turned upside down.
Oh,
That is
lovely.
the actual shape of the church. And the priest there is a lovely fellow. He's like a vampire. I don't know. He's 150 years old. He has 14 kids and 25 grandchildren. How it is.
Lovely.
Yeah, and he knows his stuff. He knows his stories, and he knows the story of his church. And he was telling us about the different pictures, the paintings that went around the wall of the church, not the central one that is dedicated to the patron saint of the church and bears their name, but the several different smaller ones around the walls. And he used to tell us how each guild of street cobblers, clothes makers, whatever, back in the day would have their own patron saint. And when it was their time to have a feast, a party, they would take this particular painting and go around the streets, and so people could worship it and celebrate in its honor. But in a bigger scale, what used to be Poseidon for the ancient Greeks, which was the god of the sea, is now Saint Nicholas, which is the patron of the merchants and sailors and the like. And as Greece is a nation of mariners, much like the British Isles, it was very important to have a very important patron saint of that particular area. Yeah, commerce.
I love the imagery of the ship because it's certainly in Christian imagery, it's very evocative. In English, if you think of a church, especially a cross-shaped church, the long bit before you get to the altar or the communion table or whatever, that long bit is called the nave, and it comes from a Latin word navis, which means ship. And in just about every European language, it's ship, shipper, nef, nefer. It's all the same word. And I love this idea, this symbolism that we as humans are in the ship of life, that we are sailing through the waters of this world towards, well, one would hope salvation. But here we are in the ship. And of course, sometimes the waters are smooth and calm and everything's lovely. But sometimes those waters are absolutely heaving and choppy and stormy. And if you're as bad a sailor as me, we're all being sick over the side. So I love this kind of analogy with the ship. And I love the fact that a church was made out of the ship. And I suspect that happened a lot in other places. Certainly in Orkney and Shetland, our northern neighbours, that people made sheds out of old boats that weren't seaworthy anymore. They simply turned them upside down, made them the roof of a shed. So there's a deep, deep symbolism going on there, isn't there?
Listening to your story made me think of a story we heard by another guest of ours we had the other day here. I think it's Amna's tale. Amna is a girl of Pakistani origin, initially from India, then Pakistan, then Canada. She resides in Canada now. She's a very educated lady, also a very religious lady. And she was telling us one of the stories that she found, I think it was in the Quran. It is a tale where the Holy Mother is giving birth. And I was thinking, listening to her story, how patriarchy in our cultures have skipped this part, because we go into the hut and then straight to the baby being born, and then the magi come and offer their presents. We skip part of the actual birth, whereas that scene exists still in the Quran. And it is the story of the Holy Mother and the dates, if I remember correctly, Simona.
Yes.
I had never fathomed the thought of it existing before hearing it. It was really interesting to see it from another lens, as you said, Fran.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah, we're having a good time doing this podcast, Simona and I. We're learning a lot.
Oh, bet. Sounds like it.
So, would it be okay if I asked for maybe a different kind of story?
Yeah.
Many.
Let me think. Well, would you like an Orkney folk tale?
Yes, but save the one about your origin for my visit, please.
That's quite a long story. So one of my favourite Orkney folk tales is actually quite short. So you've got to imagine Orkney right at the very, very top of Scotland's mainland. We're about 6 or 7 miles across the very top of Scotland. And the county, the region at the very top of the Scottish mainland is called Caithness. And Caithness is very flat and it can be quite dramatic, but it can also look quite bleak. And the story goes way, way, way back into history when there weren't actually people living in Orkney and Caithness. There were giants. And I know that giants lived all over the place, but they were particularly strong in this area. And there was a giant in Caithness. Now, giants tend to have a bit of a bad reputation, particularly in British folk tales. You know, Jack and the Beanstalk, fee, fi, fo, fum. But this giant was actually quite a gentle fellow. And he didn't want to hurt anybody. He just wanted to do his garden. He loved gardening. He loved growing flowers and he loved growing vegetables. The problem was is that the earth, the ground in Caithness was not very good. It wasn't very fertile. And he did struggle with getting things to grow. Well, he stood up one day and he looked across the Pentland Firth, and it was a beautiful, clear day, and he could see the Orkney Islands, and they were so green and so obviously rich in life and so fertile that he just thought, do you know, I could go to Orkney and I could just get a little bit of that rich, fertile soil, and that would help me with my own garden. So he got himself ready and he pulled on his massive, great leather boots and he got a casey. Now, a casey in Orkney and in Caithness is a straw basket. And it sits on your back and it's held in place by a leather strap across your chest and it leaves your hands free, you see. So he got his casey and he got his boots on and he set off across the Pentland Firth and he took a very, very large, giant strides. And within a short time, he was standing right in the middle of Orkney mainland. And he bent down and with one of his huge, enormous hands, he scooped out a great handful of earth and he put it into the casey on his back. And he bent down and with his other hand, he scooped out another great, enormous handful of earth and he put that in the casey on his back. And the casey was full. And so he thought, well, that's good. That's got some lovely Orkney soil. So he turned around and he started to go back, and he just set foot in the water when disaster struck, and the leather strap holding the casey on his back snapped. It broke and the casey just slipped from his shoulders and the two great mounds of earth fell with a great splash into the sea. And actually, you can see them to this day. In fact, looking out of my window, I can see them in the distance. And we now know them as the Hills of Hoy. And Hoy is our second biggest island. And it has two big, enormous hills in the middle of it, right out my window here. And that was it. He'd lost all his soil. And he was very upset. And he clambered back onto the land. And he was most distraught. And he started to cry. He was so disappointed, and the tears just spilled out from his eyes and they just ran down his face, all the way down his body, dripped off the end of his boots, formed little rivulets and streams, which then poured into the two big holes that he'd made with his hands. And those big holes filled with his tears and became the two biggest lochs in Orkney, Stennis Loch and Harry Loch. And once again, they are there for you to see to this day. So if anybody tells you different, well, I'm afraid we know the truth. This is how the Hills of Hoy were formed and the two lochs of Stennis and Harry. And that is the story of the Caithness giant.
Brilliant.
Thank you. It's one of my faves.
Yeah. I just love these stories, these Scottish stories with giants that create these different parts of Scotland.
There's
brilliant.
definitely a few of those. There's quite a lot of Orkney-based ones about the lochs and the hills, and and how the land was formed. Yeah, but you're right. You find them all over Scotland.
Now, we shouldn't be bad-mouthing giants, really. They have created so much in war.
Absolutely, the Giant's Causeway, and there's all sorts of great things that have been made by the giants. So yeah, so there's just a few, I think, that give giants a bad name.
In my visit in Morocco back in 23, I told the tale in a workshop I was asked to do about Perseus killing Medusa and going back and saving the dame in distress from the sea monster, etc. What people don't know is that in his passing through the northern part of Africa, he had to go through the Atlas Mountains, which are in Morocco, part of them, and those Atlas Mountains came to be then because it used to be the Titan Atlas, who was then petrified by Perseus holding the head of Medusa and turned into the mountain range.
Oh, brilliant.
So if you look at it from one particular angle, it is a lying man and his head and his beard and everything. His head and his beard will be the trees and the forests and
Oh, that's lovely.
But now that you said it, it might have been his tears creating some sort of streams and rivers. I will put it in there. Thank you, Fran. So, well, it has been wonderful, and we could carry on talking for another hour at least, I'm sure. But for the moment, due to other obligations, we have to thank you kindly for being here with us.
You're very welcome. It's really lovely to spend an hour on a Friday morning just talking to you, lovely folk, and telling stories and thinking about stories. So yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure. So thank you for inviting me, and good luck with your podcast.
Thank you very
so much. It was brilliant.
So after my 10 years of telling ghost stories in Edinburgh, when I came to Orkney, I was interested to find out what stories there were and who was telling stories. And I was very fortunate to meet and become friends with Tom Muir, who's just really the best storyteller. And he really is responsible for keeping it going in Orkney, for really resurrecting storytelling as an art form. You'd think that these traditions go back, over generations, but sometimes they really didn't. A lot of those stories were nearly lost. So Tom is just a real champion for folk tales and for storytelling in Orkney, and I'm just enormously grateful to him for, sharing with us and keeping it all going. So yeah, just like to give him a mention because he's a very special person.
And now that you mentioned Tom Muir, Fran, we should let our listeners know that they are doing a wonderful podcast themselves called Orkneyology. So people who enjoy a good podcast, other than ours, other than Tell Muses, can also go look that up. Orkneyology, folk, it's lovely.